Okay, so now in the first video, we talked about the relationship between fractions and percentages. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about the relationship between fractions and percentages. So what this implies then again is a new technique, but luckily not too bad. But what we're going to need to go ahead and use is the middle step of decimals. So what do I mean by that? First things first, to get from fraction oh my gosh, hello. To get from a fraction, geez, to a percent, we need a decimal as the middle step. So first we're gonna do is get a fraction to a decimal. And how do we go from fraction to decimal? So that's something we talked about earlier. Well, that implies long division. So that is the middle step that we need, and everything else then carries of how we go from decimal to percentage. So again, if you're having issues with long division, please go ahead and check out our earlier videos of long division, because again, that is how we're going to go ahead and get the decimal. And then from that point, the steps repeat. So luckily enough though, because remember there's ongoing decimals we talked about, or repeating decimals and all that good stuff. So we just need to go ahead and have it to the nearest hundredth. So 3 spots after the decimal, so we can go ahead and round. That's all we need when we are doing our long division. Don't worry about continuing further or never stopping. And then again, decimal to percentage, we want to multiply by 100, so we're going to be moving that decimal spot to the right. And then lastly, our answer is going to end up as a percentage, so we want to add the percent symbol. Okay, let's look at an example. So convert the following fractions to percent. So our first example is 5/9. Well, remember what we do. First thing what we have to do is long divide. Okay, so the top number goes under the bar, and now we can continue with the long division. Well, 9 does not go into 5, so we're going to need a 0 to help us out. But remember, since 9 does not go into 5, that means immediately we're dealing with 0 point something. We're dealing with something less than 1, because no whole numbers of 9 go into 5. It's smaller. 5 is smaller than 9, so it's going to be a decimal smaller than 1. Okay, now we can see that 9 will go into 50 how many times? Well, 5 times. 9 times 5 is 45. We go ahead and get the difference of 5. And again, 9 does not go into 5, but I can pull down a 0 to help me out. And yet again, I get 9 goes into 55 times. 9 times 5 is 45. And again, we're going to continue until we have 3 digits after the decimal for rounding purposes. Yet again, we get a difference of 5. Here we can yet again see 9 goes into 5, or I'm sorry, 9 does not go into 5, so we need another 0 to help us out, and 9 goes into 55 times. And then we can stop there, so we can round. So we get 0.555. Well, if we round this to the nearest hundredth, first things first, remember the place values. We have the tenths, the hundredths, the thousandths. So that means that we're looking at this middle guy. Well, in order to round him, I have to look at the neighbor. Notice the neighbor falls into the category where we're going to round up by 1. So we're going to have 0.56. I'll put after rounding. Okay, then from that point, remember what's our next step? Well, we want to now multiply by 100. So from this step, this is where we have the steps that we talked about in the first video from going a decimal to a percentage. So remember, we identify the decimal spot and then we end up multiplying by 100, which will simply move the decimal to the right. So we have 1, 2, and we end up getting then 56%. And that is our final answer. Okay, let's keep going. Our next example, we have 5 2/3. Well, 5 2/3 is a mixed number. I have to go ahead and first convert it to a fraction. So and again, that's something that you always want to do. Remember, we multiply the denominator by the whole number, and then whatever that product is, we add it to the numerator. So 5 times 3 is 15. 15 plus 2 is 17. So this becomes 17 thirds. And now we can go ahead, oh, my hand itches. Now we can go ahead and perform the steps. So remember, first things first, I got a long divide. 17 goes underneath the bar, or I used to tell when I was tutoring kids, I would say top dog goes under the house. Okay, and now we continue with long division. Well, how many times does 3 go into 17? 3 goes into 17 5 times. And now we can see, or I'm sorry, let me take this a step back. How many times does 3 go into 1? Well, 3 cannot go into 1, so that implies that 3 can only go into 17 5 times. And we're immediately going to put 5 point, because first of all, we used up all of our numbers, and then 3 does not go into 17 perfectly, so it's going to be 5 and some change. So we want to figure out what this change is. So 3 times 5 is 15. And 17 minus 15 gives us a difference of 2. 3 does not go into 2, so we're going to pull down a 0 to help us out. And again, we want to make sure to get 3 digits for rounding purposes. So 3 goes into 20 6 times. 3 times 6 is 18. We get a product of 18. 20 minus 18 gives a difference of 2. Yet again, 3 does not go into 2, so we need a 0 to help us out. 3 goes into 20. Yet again, 6 times. 3 times 6 is 18. And yet again, 20 minus 18 gives a product of 2. One more 0 to pull down. And there we get our last 6, since 3 goes into 26 times. So we want to go ahead and round this digit. And again, notice, who do we want to round? Well, this middle 6 yet again. So we look at this 6. We look at the neighbor, we see that the neighbor falls into the category of 5 or more, so then we want to round the 6 to a 7. So instead of 5.666, we get 5.67 is what we want to look at. So remember what happens. We take our decimal now, and we multiply by 100, since that's what happens. That's the process. Well, remember when we multiply by 100, what actually ends up happening? The decimal moves 2 spots to the right. That's what shifts the decimal. So we end up then having 567%. And if you notice, again, this is a number greater than 1, a fraction greater than 1. So our decimal, or I'm sorry, our percentage should for sure be greater than 1. So that is how we go. Fraction to percent. Now let's go the other way. Because remember, if we know one thing, we should be able to undo it by another technique. So now let's talk about percent to fraction. So for what we want to do is write the value of the percent as the numerator and 100 as the denominator. And why do we want to do that? Well, remember, what does percent mean? Percent means out of 100. And remember, fractions represent parts out of a whole. And our whole is 100%, completion of something. But the biggest challenge, again, is simplifying. And then I have a note here. If the percent is not a whole number, then multiply the numerator and denominator by 10. I have an exponent of x because that number is subject to change, where x represents the amount of decimal places. So that's something we'll look at and we'll come back to in our second example. Okay, first things first, convert the following percents to fractions. Well, again, here we have our percent. We have 158%. What is that implying? Well, remember what percent means. Percent means out of 100. So this is 158 out of 100. But again, you have to simplify. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. And we know for sure we have to simplify for sure. Because if you notice, they're both even numbers. So they at least have 2 in common. That's what we know. So we'll start there. They're both even numbers. So let's pull out their 2. So let's simplify. Well, what is for 158, 2 times 79 is our product, our factors. Well, for 100, we have 2 times 50. And again, if you notice here, this is our form of 1. They both have a 2 in common, and that's what we can simplify out and leave 79 over 50. 79 is a prime number, so this is as far as simplifying is going to go. So that is our final answer, 79 over 50. Remember, you have to simplify. If you do not simplify, I will mark down. So please make sure, again, your multiplication is up to par. Okay. Let's look at our next example. So 9 over 10%. I don't know how to say that. 9/10%. So let's go back to this note. If the percent is not a whole number, notice this is not a whole number, it's a fraction. What do we have to do? We have to multiply the numerator and denominator by some multiple of 10, where x represents the amount of decimal places. So what do I mean by that? First things first, 9 over 10, if we were to look at it as a decimal, this is equal to 0.9%. That's what we're looking at. And of course, you could always verify with division. So, and the reason why I want to turn it into a decimal is because that's kind of what the note helps verify with a decimal. So what do I want to do is notice, so let's go back. It says by 10 times, some multiple of 10, where x represents the amount of decimal places. So notice we only have one number after the decimal place. So where x represents the amount of decimal places, that means we're going to have 10 to the first. So that's just 10. So that implies we're going to have 0.9% times 10. So let's say, on a side note, if we had 0.09%, well, we have 2 digits after the decimal. So that means that we would multiply 0.09 times 10 squared. Well, what is 10 squared? That is 100. 10 times 10 is 100. So that's what I mean by that. So now we go ahead and multiply by 10. Well, that is where you want to do some side multiplication of what is 0.9 times 10. Well, 0.9 times 10 is 9. That's what we're looking at. So we're looking at 9%. Well, what do? Remember, percentage means out of 100. So this implies then we want to take our 9 and throw it out of 100. And in this case, 9 and 100 do not have anything in common. 9 only has 1 and 9 and 3, and 100 is not divisible by 3 or 9. So this is our final answer. And that is it for our second video.